The morning the lake disappeared was the morning the HOA finally understood Daniel Reed. Just hours before their grand opening celebration, the water they had built their floating restaurant on was suddenly gone. But to understand why the lake was empty that morning, you have to understand what the HOA did first. Daniel Reed had owned the quiet forest lake for nearly 15 years. Long before the surrounding neighborhood was built, the water had been part of his land, fed by a small controlled reservoir system hidden beyond the tree line. When developers built luxury homes nearby, the HOA quickly claimed control over anything that looked like community space. And the lake looked perfect. Clear water, wooden docks, beautiful views. Tourists even stopped by sometimes to take pictures. The HOA president, Linda Matthews, saw opportunity immediately. One evening during a community meeting, she proudly announced a new project, a floating restaurant on the lake. She said confidently, residents applauded. A scenic dining platform in the middle of the water sounded like a perfect attraction. But Daniel sat quietly in the back of the room, because there was one problem: the lake wasn't HOA property. It never had been. When Daniel calmly explained that the lake belonged to his private land title, the board dismissed him. Linda simply smiled and said something that would later become very important. "We'll handle the paperwork." And from that moment forward, construction began anyway. What the HOA didn't realize was that Daniel had one very simple way to remind them exactly who owned the lake. Construction started quickly. Within weeks, workers floated large platforms into the center of the lake. Wooden walkways connected the structure to the shore, and colorful banners advertised the future attraction, the Lakeview Floating Bistro, opening soon. Residents loved the idea. Families stopped to watch the progress every evening. But Daniel Reed watched quietly from the far edge of the property. He never protested again, he never argued, and that made the HOA board even more confident. Linda Matthews assumed silence meant surrender, but Daniel wasn't surrendering, he was waiting, because the lake that everyone admired wasn't entirely natural. Years earlier, Daniel had installed a controlled drainage system as part of a wildlife conservation project on the property. Hidden behind a row of tall pines stood a small metal gate connected to underground pipes, a simple mechanism. Turn one valve, and the lake would slowly empty into the lower wetlands. It wasn't dangerous. It was designed to regulate water levels during heavy storms, but it also meant something very important. The water could disappear if Daniel chose, and the HOA had never asked about that system. They were too focused on their grand opening event, live music, food trucks, a ribbon-cutting ceremony scheduled for Saturday morning. By Friday night, the floating restaurant was fully decorated, lights sparkled across the water, everything looked perfect, except for one quiet figure standing deep in the trees near the old metal valve. Daniel Reed had finally decided it was time. The launch day celebration was planned for sunrise. Residents arrived early, excited to see the new floating restaurant officially open. Music equipment was being unloaded, tables were set, colorful banners waved gently in the morning breeze. Linda Matthews stood proudly near the ribbon, rehearsing her opening speech, but something felt strange. The wooden walkway leading to the floating platform creaked loudly. One worker stopped and stared at the water. "Is it just me?" he said slowly, "or is the lake lower?" At first, no one paid attention, but within minutes, the change became obvious. The waterline had dropped several inches, then several feet. People started whispering. Linda walked quickly to the edge of the dock and looked down. Mud banks were beginning to appear. The floating restaurant platform tilted slightly as the water continued to sink lower and lower. Someone shouted from the shoreline, "The lake is draining." And they were right. A slow but powerful current pulled water toward the far side of the basin. Within an hour, the once deep lake had transformed into a shallow muddy field. The floating restaurant platform sat awkwardly on the ground, completely stranded. Linda stared across the empty basin in disbelief. Then she saw Daniel Reed standing quietly near the treeline, watching. And suddenly the HOA president realized something they should have understood months ago. The lake had never belonged to them. The crowd quickly gathered near Daniel. Confusion filled the air. What happened to the lake? One neighbor asked. Daniel remained calm. "It's draining," he said simply. Linda stormed toward him, her face pale. "You did this." Daniel didn't deny it. Instead, he pointed toward the exposed lakebed. "Actually, the system did exactly what it was designed to do." Linda clenched her hands. "You sabotaged our opening." Daniel shook his head. "No," his voice stayed steady. "I regulated my property." The words hung heavily in the morning air. Daniel explained slowly so everyone could hear. The lake had a legal water management system connected to the surrounding wetlands. It allowed him to control levels during storms or droughts. Perfectly legal, fully documented. and entirely on his land. Linda tried to argue, but the gathered residents were already realizing something important. The HOA had never asked Daniel for permission to build anything on the water, they simply assumed authority. Now their expensive floating restaurant sat stranded in thick mud, tables tilted, decorations hanging awkwardly. A grand opening event with no lake beneath it, and Daniel wasn't finished explaining, because draining the water was only part of the story. The real surprise came when the county official arrived to review the situation. The county inspector arrived shortly after noon. By then, the drained lakebed had become the center of attention across the neighborhood. Residents walked carefully along the muddy edges, staring at the grounded restaurant platform. The inspector studied the construction permits carefully, then he looked at Linda Matthews. Did the HOA receive written authorization from the property owner? He asked. Linda hesitated. Well, we assumed. The inspector raised an eyebrow. You assumed? Daniel handed over a folder. Inside were the original property documents, including the lake management system and land boundaries. The inspector reviewed them slowly, then he sighed. The lake is entirely private property. Linda's confidence faded. But the restaurant was already built, she said. The inspector nodded toward the stranded structure. Yes, he replied, and unfortunately it was built without proper land use approval. The crowd fell silent. Linda finally understood the problem. Removing the floating restaurant would now cost more than building it, and the HOA board would be responsible. But Daniel wasn't interested in revenge. He simply looked across the drained lakebed thoughtfully, because he had another plan in mind, and once the water returned, the lake might become something even better than before. Over the next week, workers carefully dismantled the floating restaurant. The wooden platforms were removed piece by piece from the muddy basin. Linda Matthews attended every step of the process. Her earlier confidence had been replaced with quiet reflection. Daniel watched from the shoreline. He didn't celebrate, he didn't criticize, he simply waited. Once the structure was removed completely, Daniel returned to the hidden valve near the tree line. With one slow turn, the system began reversing the drainage. Water flowed back from the connected wetlands. Gradually, the lake began to refill. Residents gathered along the shore again, watching the transformation. The empty basin slowly became a lake once more. Clear water returned, birds circled overhead, and the peaceful view everyone loved slowly came back to life. Linda eventually approached Daniel. I should have asked first, she admitted quietly. Daniel nodded. The lake was always meant to be shared, he replied, but it still needed respect. The community had learned something important that week: ownership matters, communication matters even more, and sometimes the quiet person everyone ignores is the one who understands the land best. But the final moment of the story would come during the next HOA meeting. 2 weeks later, the community gathered again in the HOA meeting hall. This time, the atmosphere felt very different. Linda Matthews stood before the residents and took a deep breath. The board made a mistake, she admitted openly. She explained that the HOA would no longer attempt to control the lake without Daniel's involvement. Instead, a new agreement had been created. The lake would remain Daniel's property, but residents would continue enjoying fishing, kayaking, and peaceful walks along the shore. No restaurants, no large developments, just the natural beauty the lake had always offered. Daniel stood quietly near the back of the room. He never wanted conflict, he only wanted people to understand one simple truth. The lake wasn't a business opportunity, it was part of the land, and land always deserves patience and respect. Outside the meeting hall, the sunset reflected beautifully across the calm water once again. The floating restaurant was gone, but the lake had returned stronger than ever. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem isn't shouting louder, sometimes it's simply turning the right valve at the right moment. And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.